Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive? Today, we're going to be tackling a topic that I think will be really fascinating to unpack.
Definitely.
Cross-dressing, specifically with men.
Yeah.
We'll be looking at the why, the how, the what it all means,
Right.
and we're diving deep into a podcast episode called Unraveling Identity, which is just jam-packed with these really personal stories.
Yeah, and you know what's so interesting? So many of these stories, they don't start with this conscious decision to challenge societal norms or anything like that.
Right.
It often really begins with just this little seed of curiosity, often planted way back in childhood.
Yeah, you're so right. It's not this calculated thing, right? It's more like Unraveling Identity talks about this almost universal experience
Yeah.
where, you have a young boy, he sees a female family member in a dress, could be his mom, could be his sister.
Right.
And there's this pull this
Yeah.
wonder,
Mhm.
what would it feel like to wear that?
Totally. And it just makes me think about how that ties into childhood development in general.
Oh, absolutely.
Kids are all about exploration, figuring out their world, pushing boundaries,
I like.
and clothing with all of its textures and all these societal implications. It kind of just becomes another avenue for that exploration.
Oh, yeah, 100%. But then, and this is where things get really interesting,
Yeah.
you have all these societal norms coming in, right? Like drawing a line in the sand.
Oh, yeah.
Saying, nope, this is for boys, this is for girls, and that's it.
Right.
But here's the thing. Instead of squashing that curiosity, it almost
Yeah.
has the opposite effect,
It totally does. It's like forbidden fruit all of a sudden.
Yes.
Something that's seemingly so simple, like trying on an article of clothing, now has this air of mystery and intrigue and
Early.
even a little bit of rebellion.
Exactly. Okay, so we've got this early curiosity kind of simmering beneath the surface.
Right?
But what Unraveling Identity really emphasizes is that when cross-dressing does happen, it often starts in this really private space.
It's like you need that safe space, right? Away from all the judgment, all the preconceived notions, where you can kind of just be free to explore these feelings.
Yes. And it might be as simple as, I don't know, a boy trying on his sister's dress when no one else is home.
Right. Or experimenting with makeup.
Yeah. Discovering this whole side of themselves they didn't even know was there.
Totally. And it's funny because the podcast makes this super important distinction, right? This exploration, it's not always directly about gender identity, at least not at first.
Right.
It can be more about the experience itself, the
Yeah.
emotions that trying on these different clothes unlocks.
It's so true. And that really stuck with me because we often make these assumptions,
Of course.
But Unraveling Identity really digs into that, the tension between what society says it means to be a man and this just very personal, often unspoken desire for a different kind of self-expression.
Absolutely. It's almost like navigating uncharted territory, right?
Yeah.
Trying to make sense of the messages you're getting from the outside world, but then this deep yearning you have inside.
Yeah.
It's a lot, especially for younger guys who are already figuring out who they are and where they fit in.
For sure. And it makes you wonder, at what point does this private exploration, this personal thing, at what point does it become something more?
Yeah, that's a great question.
When does it evolve into challenging those deeply ingrained societal norms we were talking about?
Right.
When does that shift happen?
It's like it goes from this very internal thing to something, more outward.
Yeah,
Right.
like a form of expression almost.
Exactly. And Unraveling Identity really highlights that for some, cross-dressing becomes this way to push back against those norms, those expectations.
Yeah.
It's less about secrecy at that point and more about
Being seen.
yeah, exactly. Like you said, being seen
Yeah.
and expressing yourself authentically.
It's like clothing becomes this whole visual language, a way to communicate something that words just, I don't know, can't quite capture.
It's powerful.
Yeah. And there's this one story in the podcast that really stuck with me about this guy who started cross-dressing when he was a teenager.
Okay.
And he talks about this incredible feeling of freedom,
Yeah.
He's finally shedding this skin that never quite fit.
Wow.
And you can just step into his true self.
It's interesting you say that because that feeling of authenticity, right, really is a huge motivator for a lot of people.
Exactly.
It's like we all want to be seen and accepted for who we are deep down, right?
100%.
Even and maybe especially those parts of ourselves that society might consider different or
Taboo. It really makes you think, because even if we don't personally relate to cross-dressing, I think we've all felt that pressure to, like, fit in,
Oh, absolutely.
to conform to these boxes that society tries to put us in.
All the time.
Right. Like, think about careers, relationships, even just our hobbies.
Oh, yeah, totally.
There are all these messages about what's considered appropriate.
Normal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Based on whether you're a man or a woman.
And what unraveling identity does so well is it reminds us that, okay, yes, cross-dressing can be about challenging these gender norms, but it's not always directly tied to gender identity in the way we might typically think of it, you know?
Right. It's not as clear-cut as we often make it seem.
Exactly.
Like, it doesn't automatically mean someone identifies as transgender.
Right. And I really appreciate how the podcast breaks down some of the terminology we hear a lot.
Yeah, it can be confusing.
It really can, like cisgender, gender fluid.
Right. They did a great job explaining those.
I think those clear explanations are so important.
Definitely. Makes it accessible to everyone.
Exactly.
I had this other quote, this one from a guy who started cross-dressing in his 20s. And he talks about this realization he had that he doesn't have to fit neatly into these boxes of man or woman.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, like he found his own unique space within this whole spectrum of gender expression.
It's not about these rigid categories. It's about finding what feels true for you.
Totally. And I think that's a really important message to remember, whatever your journey is.
For sure. Like any journey of self-discovery, it's rarely ever linear, right?
Right.
It can be messy and confusing and full of these twists and turns.
And the podcast makes it clear that, like, there are challenges along the way.
For sure, both internal and external.
Right. And it's not always easy to navigate those.
Absolutely. You know, there can be these internal struggles like fear and insecurity,
Mm.
and then the external stuff like judgment from other people.
Yeah, and those can be really tough to deal with. It's like, those are the hurdles you really have to overcome, right? To live authentically, to be true to yourself.
Exactly. And it takes guts, you know?
Yeah.
It takes real courage to put yourself out there, knowing that some people might not get it, might not approve.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And I think a lot of us would struggle with that, no matter what it is we're afraid to show the world.
Absolutely. But what I love about unraveling identity is that they don't just focus on the challenges.
Right.
They really highlight how, like, the rewards of living authentically, they can be huge, like life-changing even.
Yeah, like, what does that actually look like?
Well, imagine finally letting go of all those expectations, you know?
Yeah.
All that pressure from society, and you can just be yourself, unapologetically.
Wow. Yeah, that's powerful.
Right. It's about finding that sense of peace and acceptance within yourself, not needing anyone else to validate you.
And I think that's what resonated with me most about the podcast. You know, it doesn't try to give you this, like, one-size-fits-all answer.
Because there isn't one, right?
Exactly. There's no right or wrong way to experience this. It's so personal.
It truly is. And what feels empowering for one person might feel totally different for someone else, and that's totally okay.
Yeah, no judgment, right? It's about honoring your own journey, whatever that looks like.
Exactly. And defining authenticity on your own terms.
I love that. Defining authenticity on your own terms.
It's your life, right?
It is. And I feel like we could talk about this for days, you know?
Oh, for sure. This is just scratching the surface.
Yeah, there's so much more to unpack when it comes to identity and expression and, like, challenging all these norms.
Right. And it makes you think, what if we did live in a world where those norms were less rigid? Less about fitting in and more about, like, you know, just being yourself.
Oh, 100%.
How might we express ourselves differently? What would we discover about ourselves if we felt truly free to explore?
That is such a good question to sit with, and I think it's something for all of us to ponder, no matter who we are or how we choose to express ourselves.
Exactly.
So, to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. I hope it sparked some curiosity. Maybe even challenge some of those preconceived notions we all have.
It's all about learning and growing, right?
Yeah, always. And remember, it's okay to question things, to explore, and most importantly, to embrace the beautiful complexity of what it means to be human.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Until next time.